Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast introduction to this week's Thomas Jefferson. I am delighted, even thrilled, to be sharing this program with my beloved child, Catherine Missouri Walker Jenkinson, who is a graduate student at Oxford University. You're about 5,000 miles away from Bismarck, North Dakota, or vice versa, and yet I see you as if you were in the next room. An amazing moment in the history of technology, among other things.
It's so cool. It really is amazing. It feels like we're sitting across the table. And in fact, the audio is probably better because I can't hear the whirring of the dishwasher or cars driving by. It's really incredible.
Which we would do.
Wow.
So this program is
Wow.
about alcohol in the age of Jefferson. And really, I don't think we've ever done this program before. In the history of the Jefferson Hour, 30 years. Charles Bankhead's story is so upsetting to me to think that there was domestic violence at Monticello, and that, and nobody knew what to do about it. Finally, Anne Randolph's father, Thomas Mann Randolph, his only solution is to knock Bankhead on the head with a fire poker. That's no answer to these problems. It maybe was the only answer that was available, but violence upon violence, it's just, I know situations of domestic violence. I've seen them in my life, and I know how horrific it was. But I think the important point is we've never done this show before. You brought a particular sensibility to it. I think you're a little impatient with Jefferson here because I think you think, well, why didn't you do something? So I don't know what that something would have been, but yeah.
I don't mean to be impatient. It's just that you want to believe that a family as powerful as the Jeffersons or the Randolphs would be able to protect their daughter and granddaughter. And of course, that's not how this works. The domestic abuse is widespread, it's complex, it's often hidden. But when it's so public in this way and it escalates to the father of Jefferson's granddaughter hitting his son-in-law in the head with a poker,
I've been
tells
wanting
me
to
that
do that. I've been wanting to do that, but that's
to
another.
me that's so mean. But the fact that this had been clearly going on and somehow escalated, and that this is the only thing we know about. Of course, maybe there were efforts that aren't written about, or this was handled privately, and so there aren't records, and so there's so much here that we can't know. But I just find the whole thing so not surprising, but nevertheless tragic.
Absolutely tragic, and it's so, when I first started doing this work a long time ago, I went to Charlottesville, visited Monticello for the first time, and got an appointment through a friend with Dumas Malone, the great Jefferson biographer who wrote the 6-volume definitive biography of Thomas Jefferson. He was old and blind, and he had terrible heart problems, and he could barely see. He was writing the last of his 6 volumes, The Sage of Monticello. And The Sage of Monticello, it's a book about how all the world wanted to know what was on Jefferson's mind, and visitors came from all over the country, even from abroad. And Lafayette came in 1824, and Jefferson sold his library to Congress, and he was reading, and he would go to his other plantation at Poplar Forest and take 2 of his granddaughters with him, at different children at different times, and they would spend 3 weeks or 2 months there, and they would have these seminars. And the picture you get is just so beautiful of this glorious Renaissance man, in retirement, poor but still genteel, in love with his grandchildren, and so on. And then you see this story, and you realize it wasn't usually like that. It was usually crazy. And if it weren't for Charles Bankhead, Jefferson's son-in-law Thomas Mann Randolph was a handful in himself. Both Randolph and Jack Epps, the 2 husbands of the 2 daughters, were congressmen at the same time while Jefferson was president. And Jefferson, of course, said, "Come live with me in the White House. We'll be bachelors together." And so they did. And Thomas Mann Randolph got it into his head that Jefferson preferred Jack Epps, and so he moved out into a boarding house. And Jefferson, the president of the United States, is left to write letters almost begging Randolph to come back, into the bosom of your loving family. And no, of course, I don't love your brother-in-law more than I love you. And you just realize I guess, the universality of human pain.
Well, and also we want to draw a clear distinction between being a handful and being an abuser, which is very different. And I kind of resent this idea of a sort of boys will be boys. And I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, or even indeed that that's what Jefferson was doing, but it's just, it's shocking to see the same narrative played out over and over again, where people are being abused and they're seemingly they seemingly were not helped, let's say. And of course, I acknowledge that it's easy to sit here in 2023 and think about this situation about which we have very little information, and to say, why didn't Jefferson do X? Why didn't Randolph do Y? But that's not to say that it isn't extremely troubling, nevertheless.
But it's an important story in the Jefferson biography. It's really an important story because it shows that it can happen in any household. It shows that you can be the president of the United States, but you can't control your own grandson-in-law. It shows that Jefferson's myth, the myth that he created of himself as this Horatian, Virgilian figure, is a wholly inadequate explanation of what's actually going on in his life. And it also tells you about something we didn't really talk about, but we hinted at, the connection between inebriation and violence. We now know that almost all cases of domestic violence are alcohol or drug related.
Do we know that?
Yes, that the great preponderance of violence in households comes when somebody has had something to drink or another intoxicant. It's not that that's the only story, but that's why prohibition occurred. The largely women who led the prohibition movement at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th said, if you can prohibit alcohol, all these other problems will go away or greatly diminish. And of course, prohibition was never successful. But you doubt this nexus of alcohol and violence?
No, I just don't know the answer. What I do know is that alcoholism can manifest in many different ways, most of which are not violent at all. But I'm just curious about the statistic.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. So, a book you might read is The Alcoholic Republic, because I know you're moving now sort of a little bit out of the 16th and 17th centuries into the next era. And next time I'm there, let's go back to the museum and see the Hogarth prints, because they're just so extraordinary about Gin Alley and elections and so on. Just question for our viewers quickly. So you're writing about the Tower of London, and you're nearly finished, getting close. Give us in just the shortest possible compass of your focus.
I'm interested in prisoners in the Tower of London in the 16th and 17th centuries, and thinking about how the tower's use as a prison functioned during a time of huge change, religious change, political change, cultural change, and how that all fits in, both in the cases of individual prisoners and in sort of wider trends of what was going on. But I so appreciate the chance to come back to the show and to talk with you, and thanks so much for having me.
Indeed, it's been a great pleasure. So we'll go to the show now, and people can go to the website, jeffersonhour.com. They can contribute to the program. If you want Catherine to come back, you can just send oodles of money. If you want her never to come back, double it, and we'll take the highest bids. You're terrific as the host. I hope you'll agree to do a series of these in the next year, my child.
Thanks very much.
Let's go to the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with our third president. I'm your guest host, Catherine Jenkinson. Seated across from me now is President Thomas Jefferson. Hello, Mr. Jefferson.
Good day to you, young citizen.
Thank you very much for meeting with me. I'm delighted to speak to you again. I'm frankly shocked I've been invited back, but it's great to see you.
Well, there was a long discussion, and Mr. Madison said that for diplomatic purposes, we should have you back.
I have so many questions for you. I wonder if we should get right into it.
What's your proposed theme, madam?
I'd like to talk to you today about alcohol and addiction. You may know that now in 2023, at the beginning of the year, we're coming just off the heels of something known as Dry January, where thousands of people around the country take a moment to reconsider their relationship with alcohol and take a month of no drinking, regardless of how much they normally drink or don't drink. And so it got me thinking about what people thought about alcohol in your time and how they considered it.
Well, let me start in my own situation. I doubt that I was ever intoxicated in the whole course of my life. Perhaps while I was a student at William and Mary on one or two occasions, but I was a very temperate man, and I avoided hard alcohol because I had seen how it can not only devastate families and impair a person's life and achievement, but also be very socially disruptive too. We live in a frontier, and out on this frontier, many of our meals where alcohol is served end in brawls. So I made it a point early on in life to be a completely temperate man. I suppose I drank one or two glasses of the best wine I could afford almost every day of my adulthood, but the glasses were much smaller than yours, and I frequently watered down my wine with water. I'm not perhaps the best example of what happens in America in my time, but I can tell you that there was widespread drunkenness, that people drank all day long, not just in the evenings. Ale and cider and porter and beer were universal in our time, partly because our water was not necessarily healthy. But there were just habits of hard drinking. And so, by your standards in the 21st century, I suppose you would say we were a besotted nation. We didn't see it that way, but we were certainly imbibing statistically much more than people do in your time, and particularly people in government.
It's so interesting that you say that, Mr. Jefferson, because when I think about your time, I so often think about tavern culture, or sort of the tavern as a salon where people came to meet and think and talk about the new republic. But I also think about puritanical movements that were anti-alcohol, maybe decades or even a century earlier. But how do these two major movements fit together? And am I overemphasizing these sort of anti-drinking sects at your time?
The Puritans certainly were more abstemious, in theory at least, than Southerners. We were Cavaliers. We came from the Anglican tradition, and we were not as anxious about intoxicants as some of the Puritans up in New England were. But I should say this about human nature, and I hate to have to divulge it. Humans enjoy and seek inebriation, and although the Puritans might put up a good show and might have their preachers storming and railing against alcohol and alcoholism in the church, the fact is that New Englanders were frequently just as drunk as the rest of us, perhaps more secretly at times. So attempts to prohibit or to diminish the consumption of alcohol have never worked in human history. The only way to do it is my way, which is, as a young person, to adopt a strict code. I was a Stoic. I didn't want anything to be too volatile, either positively or negatively, to have an even keel, to find a golden mean, to be impervious to ecstasy on the one hand and deep sadness or grief on the other. And by training myself in this way, always to try to maintain an equanimity, I was able to avoid what I saw happening all around me in my own Virginia, and I suppose in New England, because of the heavy social pressures of the Calvinist and Puritan tradition, people probably drank more slyly than they tended to do in my Virginia.
I want to push you a little bit on that, because you're well known as perhaps the enophile of the 18th century, or of certainly of 18th century Virginia. So how do you square that, being someone who loves wine, knows a lot about wine, spends, if I may say, quite a great deal of money on wine, sir, and also being someone who claims to avoid extreme in any measure?
Well, if you're saying why wasn't I more fiscally responsible, I have no good answer for that. If you're saying, is my use of wine and my love of wine in any way a contradiction with my stoicism and my refusal to be intoxicated, I don't see an inconsistency here. Wine is not really alcohol. It has alcoholic content, of course, but we don't drink wine to get drunk. We drink wine to heighten our personalities, to liberate a certain playfulness in conversation, to to add a little aura of luster and delight to our community activities. And so, as someone who almost never took a third glass of wine, even amongst my closest friends, and even when the wine was exquisite, I believe that that sort of consumption of wine can hardly be compared to the heavy, heavy drinking of punch, of applejack, of whiskey, of gin, and other serious alcohols in my time, not just in Virginia and on the frontier, but all over the United States. So I don't really see a contradiction here. In fact, I said in letters while I was president that we should attempt to inculcate wine drinking among the American people. I said, no nation is drunken where wine is cheap, and none sober where the duties on wine turn people instead to whiskey, which has desolated our houses. So when I think of an agrarian nation of mild-mannered family farmers living under the sky and working with animals, feeding themselves and clothing themselves, I hearken back to the Roman poet Horace. I see wine as an enlivener, but certainly not as an intoxicant.
But what I don't hear you mention is beer or ale or cider. Rarely do we think about you and beer. That's more of a Ben Franklin association, or someone who's more of a, shall I say, man of the people. So
Well,
what exactly is your relationship to beer or similar substances? And what was the sort of distinction, if there was one, in your time about who drank beer and who drank wine?
well, we all drank ale and beer and cider. They were made at Monticello in great quantities. Not everyone who came to Monticello as a guest or as a family member shared my love of fine wine. You know, you can't drink a lot of wine to cover your thirst, so things like ale and porter and cider are much superior to that. Of course, I drank some of those things too, but they were not my drink of choice. But we had very large quantities. If you look at my farm book and my garden book, you will see statistically that we were brewing and we were making cider and at times even mead. You know, at this time, there were no adequate water supplies in the United States. Even in a great city like Philadelphia, people were getting their water from wells. There was no public safety regimen to make sure that that water was clean and healthy. It is true that by fermenting water in some way or other, you can produce a drink that will not kill you if taken in moderation. So certainly, if you were a guest at Monticello and you wanted cider, it would be available to you. But at dinner, which was a mid to late afternoon, there might be such drinks, but more likely you would be asked if you wanted to drink a quantity of wine, Bordeaux, when I could afford it.
Fair enough. So you're saying that your wine was imported wine. Were there vineyards already in colonial America?
There were, but not good ones. And so Philip Mazzei, who was an Italian patriot who came to visit me before the war, wanted to create American wine. And I actually gave him some land near Monticello where he could experiment with this. And he did begin to grow grapes, but nothing came of it. He soon went back to Europe on behalf of the colonial cause, and horses and other animals trampled down his vines. The thing about viticulture is that it takes an enormous amount of patience and time to produce the grapes that can give us great wine. So I wound up importing my wines from France particularly and Italy. There was wine in North Carolina called Scuppernong. It wasn't very good wine, but there were times when I was impoverished that I would drink even that. But I did not live to see a wine industry in the United States, I'm sorry to say.
So can you just quickly walk me through the process of acquiring wine from France? Are you purchasing it from wine cellars or kind of import-export dealers who are negotiating this abroad, or are you writing directly to vineyards across the Atlantic?
All of the above. So when I was in France, I made a wine tour. It really wasn't a wine tour, but wine was part of it. In 1787, and I met vignerons, I met owners of vineyards, I met negociants. These were the agents who would handle the wines of a certain district. And I made arrangements with all of them to get wine to Paris while I was still there. And then when I came back to the U.S. in November of 1789, I began to work directly with these negociants, these agents in Marseille and Bordeaux, to obtain for me the wines that I wanted. But where possible, I would write directly to the owner of the vineyard with whom I had established a kind of relationship. That was the easy part. Let me quickly describe the more difficult part. How do you exchange currencies? So I would say I would like 6 pipes. That was a way of delivering wine, or 250 bottles of champagne or of Montrachet from Burgundy. And then I would have to say that I have tobacco, which is at the wharf in Richmond. It will be shipped to London. My factor, my agent in London, will then make purchases from Bordeaux or Marseille. They will be credited against my tobacco crop in London. There were no exchange rates that were reliable. There were certainly no digital or other forms of immediate transfer of funds. And so it was a sort of a nightmare. But there were agents in London who could handle this, but it was by no means easy. And of course, I could write saying I want 400 bottles of something and maybe never hear back, because you don't know whether the letter ever arrived. 6 weeks, 2 months even, to get a letter across the Atlantic. Often letters were opened, ships went down in the sea. Ruthless postmasters at both ends would open the mail. It was not at all a simple matter. I take pride, in some sense, in having helped to create the conditions under which true wine could be shipped safely to the United States.
Fascinating, Mr. Jefferson. So many would say, why do this when it's so laborious and difficult? But to the critics, you said, why not? I'm afraid we have to stop there for the moment, but I want to ask you more questions about this. And when we return from the break, I'd like to ask you about considerations of addiction in your own time. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm your guest host, Catherine Jenkinson, and seated across from me now is the third president of the United States. Sir, before the break, we were talking about wine and consumption of alcohol in your time. Over the past few days, I've been thinking about the language that we use in the 21st century to talk about addiction. We think about alcoholism or drug dependency or any number of things. And a sort of new lexicon has emerged where people think about sobriety as potentially mindful drinking or sober curious or any number of other things as people assess their relationships with alcohol to the extent that they exist. And I wanted to ask you, what sort of language existed in the 18th century and early 19th century to describe addiction? Did this kind of language exist? Surely alcoholism existed. So how did you respond to this, or how did people in Virginia think about alcoholism?
We didn't have a word for addiction, although there, of course, was addiction. We didn't have a word for alcoholism. We would say sotted or besotted or drunk or something of that sort. We were very primitive. I think it's fair to say that you are infinitely better at facing these sorts of examples of human sadness, human weakness, and human darkness than we were. We were a frontier society, cutting down trees and opening new fields, plowing lands that had never been plowed in the history of the world before. We were making barrels. We were building ships.
All of these things that you're describing are not things that you, Thomas Jefferson, sitting at your desk in Monticello, were doing. You had nothing to do with any of this. So yes, of course this was happening, but you must be able to admit that you were completely outside of any of this sort of physical labor or industry that was emerging.
True. I was a relatively well-off tobacco planter living on a remote mountain in Virginia. Now, we had to do all of those things, and I did know how to do such things. I could shoot a gun and kill venison and butcher meat, and I could do carpentry work, and I could plow a field, but I need hardly say that that wasn't the style of the Virginia Cavalier. We did very little physical work, and we hired people or owned others that would do this sort of work for us. But if I were going to have a cabinet made, I would often help the cabinet maker with some basic skills, or to show how I wanted a certain turn of the wood or a certain type of varnish. But of course, I'm not making any claims that I was a frontiersman out in wild Kentucky, killing a bear or something. My point was that we did not have a sophisticated language or mental health infrastructure to talk about these things. We were probably more tolerant of drunkenness than you are in your own time. If somebody got drunk at a tavern and rode his horse back to his farm, fell off, he might damage himself, but he's not going to damage others. So there was no drunken driving or anything of that sort. So it was a much simpler time. It was a 3-mile-per-hour world. But in direct answer to your question, of course there was addiction. I can tell you about people that I knew who were addicted, and not only to alcohol, but to opium. And of course there was alcoholism. But finding the line between drunkenness and alcoholism was difficult in my time because, as I said, there was such widespread heavy drinking all day long. Benjamin Franklin, for example, talks about working in the printing press when he was a young man as an apprentice. And he said that he saved money while the other workers would have a pint for breakfast, then they would have a pint at mid-morning, and they would have 1 or 2 pints at lunch and more in the afternoon. So they were drinking away their profits in addition to impairing their capacity to be alert.
Certainly don't wish to imply that everyone's experiences with alcohol are the same in this way. But what about sobriety? Surely there were people who didn't drink, but were there people you knew who had difficult relationships with alcohol that, as a result of something, stopped drinking or became sober in some way? And if so, how did you talk about it? Did they talk about it? What was the culture around this?
Well, let me give you one example, and then we can go on to others. But of course, you've heard of my young protege, Meriwether Lewis. He lived with me in the White House for 2 years as my private secretary before he went on his famous journey up the Missouri River in 1804. Lewis had grown up within sight of Monticello. He was young enough to be my son. I had no surviving sons. I collected proteges. I enjoyed being a mentor to young, promising men from my district of Virginia, helping them to get on with their lives, to read hard books, to pursue their professions in law or agriculture or medicine. And Mr. Lewis was one of the most promising of these young men. So I invited him to be my private secretary when I became the president in the spring of 1801, and he left the Ohio country to come back to take up his position. He lived in the East Room. What I noticed, I'm sorry to say, is that at my dinner parties, 2 or 3 a week and exquisite wines, he began to drink more than was probably prudent. And so I noticed this, and it caused me concerns. It would cause me concern in any promising person to watch this happen, but it caused me particular concern because of the great affection I had for him, and also because he was employed by me for the government of the United States, for the executive branch. It seldom became an issue. Then I sent him off on his famous trip, and I felt that this probably would cure this, because you can only take so much alcohol on a transcontinental journey of that sort. Alcohol weighs about 8 pounds per gallon. And so I felt that the adventure itself, the thrill, the sense of wonder, the new prospects, the discoveries would be intoxicating in and of themselves. That was kind of the spirit of the Enlightenment. When he came back, he was a national hero, and he was feted. There were balls and receptions and all sorts of parties up and down the trip from St. Louis to Virginia and to Washington, D.C. And then I noticed that he was returning to that habit of drinking rather too much. And it worried me because I had appointed him to be the first governor of Louisiana Territory. It worried me because he still had his 3-volume book to write, and it worried me because I saw a really extraordinary young man struggling. Here's the point I think that you wish me to examine. There was no treatment for this. There was no intervention. I might have said once or twice, perhaps enough wine for tonight, Mr. Lewis, but I would have had to be exquisitely careful and polite. What he drank on his own, of course, I can't know, but certainly he had access to alcohol far beyond my famous White House dinner parties. And so when this happens, and this happened to me more than once in my life, you watch with concern, then deeper concern, and eventually stress. And you feel impotent and not knowing how you can possibly help. You can't say there's a treatment program in Philadelphia. You can't say there are meetings that you can go to with other people who have a problem. That it was something that we tolerated, and it was something that I watched, but there's only so much you can do by example, and there's only so much you can do by gentle admonition. And so I watched this young man damage himself and his prospects by this. And let me say, with per Lewis, I think a part that will really interest you is that this was connected to some mental health issues. His family on both sides had a history of mental illness. The word we used was hypochondria. It's not the same as the way you use it in your time. An account I wrote of Mr. Lewis after his death for the first edition of the journals of Lewis and Clark, I said that this was family constitutional problem. And I said, when he was living with me in Washington, and I'm quoting now, madam, I observed at times sensible depressions of mind, but knowing their constitutional source, I estimated their course by what I had seen in his family during his Western expedition. The constant exertion which that required of all the faculties of body and mind suspended those distressing affections. But after his establishment at St. Louis in sedentary occupations, they returned upon him with redoubled vigor and began seriously to alarm his friends. I had hoped that the trip might cure him, put all that behind him, but when he came back, his depressions, if anything, were more severe than they had been. And now, of course, I could no longer monitor him because he wasn't living with me in Washington. He wasn't in Charlottesville. He was out on the howling frontier where alcohol was even more abused, more available, more debilitating than it was in a relatively civilized place like Washington, D.C.
Sure. And of course, the case of Lewis is particularly interesting because he goes on this long journey with Clark and with the Corps of Discovery, and they do take a great deal of alcohol. But am I right that they ran out at a certain point?
Yes, they took 180 gallons or something, but you can only carry so much. Those boats were laden with medicine and with scientific instruments and a small portable library and writing equipment and guns and ammunition and gunpowder and barrels of pork and so on. The payload was gigantic. I think it's something like 30 tons when they left St. Charles, Missouri on May 14th, 1804 in 3 boats. And they were just barely above water at that point. And so they could only take so much alcohol. And when they left, they didn't really have any hope of resupply. It may interest you that they ran out, according to the journals, on the 4th of July, 1805, at the Great Falls. So they're at the Great Falls, which Mr. Lewis discovered. He said it was second only to Niagara. It's the anniversary of American independence, I hesitate to say, but of my Declaration of Independence. And now they're at this incredible place up in the wilds of what you call Montana, and they gave out the last of their whiskey to the men. And he said that the men got a little merry, it affected them because they had been without it for some time. And then they danced until there was a thunderstorm, and the thunderstorm in the evening put an end to that. And one of the men made some beer out on the West Coast, but it wasn't apparently of much taste or value. It wasn't until they were on the return journey in August and September of 1806, when they were on the lower Missouri coming down towards St. Louis, that they met some traders who then gave them tobacco and alcohol.
I will say I'm going to put an asterisk on the claim that Lewis discovered the Great Falls, but being that as it may, isn't it the case that before they ran out, they had some sort of daily rationing of whiskey to the men?
Yes, under Army protocols, the men were entitled to a quarter of a glass of whiskey per day, and they didn't do that every day because, of course, they would have run out much sooner, but they routinely, especially after a difficult day where there had been a snag, wind had blown the boat, or they had lost control of their towing lines, or whatever it might be, if they'd had a difficult encounter with natives. After a difficult day, Mr. Lewis made a special thing of handing out quantity of whiskey, a gill, as it was called. If he could have carried 5 times as much alcohol as he did, they would have probably used it. But since they could only carry a limited amount. As to discovery, my friend, he was, we think, the first white person ever to encounter the Great Falls.
Mr. Jefferson, you're making my argument for me. He was simply the first white man to write about the Great Falls. In any case, let's move on back to this question of rationing. Would the captains have been subject to the same amount of rationing of whiskey each evening, or might someone like Lewis have taken more? Is it possible he had his own supply?
Unclear. So certainly the 2 captains, and by the way, Lewis was a captain and Clark technically not, but we'll call them co-captains. They stayed in a special tent, a teepee, that was rented to them by this ruffian named Toussaint Charbonneau. They lived sort of apart at the edge of the camp in a certain way, which is important in military protocol. They probably drank more per day than the enlisted men got in their ration. When the whiskey ran out on the 4th of July, it's not altogether clear that it ran out for everyone or just for the men. It's possible, and I can't answer this with any certainty at all, it's possible that the 2 captains had a private supply that they kept back, partly for medicinal purposes, for genuine medicinal purposes, and we just don't know. There's no adequate way to know this. I can say this: I've read the journals, of course, and I've read the Biddle edition, which came out in 1814. There is never, by any of the writers of the expedition, the slightest hint that either of the captains was ever impaired. The captains themselves said that the men were occasionally impaired, if you want to use that term, that they got drunk more easily because of the exertions that they were engaged in and the dehydration of the journey. But there's never a sense that alcohol was a problem after they left Camp Wood. In the first winter, when they were staging everything, the men were able to get supplies of alcohol from local stills, and they were frequently drunk, and there were courts-martial about this. But once they got underway, without the hope of resupply, things settled down pretty quickly, I'm told.
Okay, so if we fast forward to the end of the expedition, Lewis becomes governor of the Louisiana Territory, and his work with you sort of ends. I mean, he's ostensibly working under your guidance, but he's on his own. This sort of hypochondria, as you call it, what I would call maybe depression, returns. How would you draw a distinction between that and the well-known concept of melancholy in your time? I'm thinking, of course, of Robert Burton's 1621 Anatomy of Melancholy. What is the distinction here, and how important is the concept of melancholy in the Enlightenment?
Oh, very important. And I've read Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, by the way. It's an extraordinary book. It was an attempt, it was a sort of self-treatment in a way. He set out to write a massive treatise, in a sense, to fight off his own fits of melancholia. So melancholy is a medical term that goes all the way back to the ancient world. It means black bile, essentially. And there was a humorous theory of medicine that said there were 4 elements, and if they got out of balance, then that's what made you choleric or made you sanguine or made you melancholy. And so it was a medical term, but it also was, how should I say this? In the Enlightenment, it was something. It was a little fashionable. There was a kind of a melancholy chic.
Really?
Yes, and so people would affect melancholia, a light form of it, and this was regarded as a sign of great intelligence or artistic capacity. I don't think Mr. Lewis was that. When I use the term hypochondria, which really then did mean mental illness, mental depression, and unfortunately we didn't have a very wide terminology for this. I should say, before we go on, that Dr. Benjamin Rush, up in Philadelphia, signer of the Declaration of Independence, good friend of mine, the man who helped to bring about the reconciliation between John Adams and me in 1812. He was a pioneer in mental health. He had a son who was mentally ill. He began to think hard about this in Philadelphia, wrote some important treatises on this, and he deserves to be called the father of American psychiatry, a term that did not exist, of course, because of this pioneering work. And what's even more interesting is that he worked with dreams. He felt that dreams are meaningful, often, and that we can understand more about the human predicament by looking at someone's dreams. In fact, he said it was a dream that he had that Adams and I reconciled that led him to try to get us to write to each other in 1812. He wrote to me on the first day of January 1812. He didn't mention the dreams at that point, and I replied, and you know what happened after that. But I don't want you to belittle Dr. Rush. He is a pioneer in mental health, and he had a deep sympathy. In my time, we had no way of handling mental health issues. We had insane asylums, and there was one in Williamsburg, and these insane asylums were unspeakable. People lived in their own excrement. They were chained often to the wall or the floor. They slept on straw. And then society ladies and gentlemen would stroll through these asylums and gawk at these poor. Yes, they would gawk. People were displayed in all of this suffering. And so this was not going to help anybody ever. Of course, this was just a way of putting people in an asylum and locking them away with a key. So Dr. Rush, with his deep humanity, was really the pioneer for this. for America, and I have the deepest respect for him on that account.
That's fascinating, Mr. Jefferson. I have so many more questions about that. I'm afraid we need to take another quick break. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. You're listening to your weekly conversation with Thomas Jefferson. I'm your guest host, Catherine Jenkinson. Mr. Jefferson, before the break, we were talking about Benjamin Rush and his pioneering work in mental health treatment. What sort of treatment options became available, or what did Rush think might help treat mental illness?
With mental illness, you hope it's a passing thing. You hope that it's postpartum for women or men under great stress, traumatized by their work in the war. Again, we were fairly tolerant of these things in my time, and there were no drugs. There was no pharmaceutical response to this in our time. Dr. Rush believed that you shouldn't lock people away. You should keep them in comfortable circumstances. You should talk with them in a very gentle and positive way. You should make sure they get plenty of sleep and exercise. This is the only answer to this, that there's in my time there was no other answer to this, and there's no therapy to be had. There's no pharmaceutical response. You certainly don't want someone going to an asylum unless they're in the very last stages of mental illness. We didn't have an infrastructure or institutions to handle this. We had to handle it on a family basis, and of course in the Christian world, pastors often were able to play a role. And in the Catholic world, there was even exorcism. I mean, exorcism was a real thing.
I'm aware that within your own family, there were occasionally some issues with alcohol. Would you mind speaking about this? I'm thinking, of course, of your granddaughter's husband, Mr. Bankhead.
I think you sense of how reluctant I am to talk about these very difficult private matters. I was one of the most private individuals of the era, secretive even in many regards, but I will do what I can. So my daughter Martha, two surviving daughters, Martha and Maria. Martha had 12 children between 1791 and 1818, 11 of whom lived to be adults, so she was very successful as a mother. And the first of the 12 children, born in 1791, was Anne Cary Randolph. My daughter Martha had married Thomas Mann Randolph. Anne was a lovely young woman, my first grandchild, so of course I had a special regard for her. She was talented, she was beautiful, she was a great conversationalist, she had a great sense of humor. In 1808, she let a man named Charles Bankhead talk her into marriage. He came from a relatively distinguished family. We didn't know nearly enough about him, and it turns out he was a brute who beat her. Domestic violence within the walls of Monticello, sometimes in front of others, once in front of her mother Martha. Imagine this. And he also was a drunk, a terrible drunk, and he spent a lot of time at taverns down in Charlottesville instead of running his plantation or minding the work of his life or studying for the law. He was a frequenter of taverns, and a letter by an old friend of mine, Elizabeth House Trist, talks about this. She said, "I heard with great concern that Bankhead has turned out a great sot, always frolicking, carousing at taverns. Poor Anne, I feel for her." So she had to put up not only with a severe alcoholic, a drunk, a besotted brute, but a man who beat her too. And I knew this was going on in my own house, and I'm a harmony obsessive. I can't even imagine. I would never strike anyone in the whole course of my life, and certainly never a woman under any circumstances. And this was going on. And to use an inapt metaphor, you're just trying to keep the lid on this, just to survive this, to hope that it will go away, to hope that he will improve. You step in to the extent that you can. Now, her father was in a better position to do this, Thomas Mann Randolph, and he did. I'll come to that in a minute. But I'm sorry to say he had mental health issues too, severe ones. And he also drank heavily at periods of his life. So my daughter Martha wouldn't even live with him for periods. She would live in Monticello, and he would only come for dinner and maybe not for that, because he was having his own mental breakdown. Charles Bankhead hit Anne in Monticello in front of her mother. And Martha, my daughter, a very, very resourceful person, called out for an overseer to come in and to intervene. And instead of an overseer, in walks her husband, Thomas Mann Randolph. And he was by now so enraged by what was happening to his daughter that he picked up a poker and hit Bankhead as hard as he could on the head with it. And it actually stripped the skin off of Bankhead's face. As people who witnessed this said that if he had hit him more squarely, it would have killed him. That was the level of rage that Thomas Mann Randolph felt as a loving father to this poor child. But they never were able to separate, and she died just a few months before I did in 1826. And when this happened, I went in, my first grandchild, this young, beautiful woman, I went in where she was laid out, and I just wept. You understand? I know you're a little impatient with this story because you think, why didn't somebody stop this? But I can promise you, in my time and in yours, it is very difficult to know what to do in a situation like this, and you hope against hope that it will go away or ameliorate, and it doesn't always. You don't want to interfere or intrude on other people's private lives, but at some point you can't not, and so we all believe that this hastened her death. She was born in 1791, dead by 1826. She was a very young woman, and of course, Bankhead never paid. I can tell one more quick story about it. That my grandson, the second of Martha's children, named Thomas Jefferson Randolph, we called him Jeff. He was so upset by what was happening to his sister that he actually confronted Bankhead, who was down drinking heavily in Charlottesville. He confronted him with a horsewhip, just out of rage, and then Bankhead pulled out a knife and stabbed Jeff twice, deeply, and Jeff nearly died. And all this occurred late in the afternoon. I found out about it. I'm ancient by now. This is 1819. And I got on a horse and rode down to 5 miles from the mountain down to the courthouse and the store where he had been placed on his back, bleeding and suffering. And I knelt down there and wept too. And he later wrote, Jeff later wrote, that he held up pretty well until he saw his grandfather weeping at his side, and then he just broke down. I mean, almost nobody who's listening knows the story, do they? That I had this alcoholic brute of an in-law, and that my own beloved grandson Jeff was nearly killed by this brute. I can promise you this is not by any means an unusual story in my time, and I'm guessing that it's not particularly an unusual story in your time either.
No, and of course, this underscores how widespread issues like these are, and how much there is to be done, both in terms of resources available for treatment and also to protect the most vulnerable. Mr. Jefferson, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for speaking with me today. I know this has been a terribly difficult conversation at points, and I appreciate your candor.
Well, thanks for releasing me. I was about to ask for that. I feel so upset now to even be discussing this, and I think you can sense that. Perhaps you can talk with somebody else for the rest of the program, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jefferson. I'm going to speak now to the host and founder of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Clay Jenkinson. Hi there.
Hello, my daughter. So, Catherine, you're terrific. Snarky, of course, but terrific today. You're at Oxford. I'm in North Dakota. So just quickly tell us what you're doing at Oxford University.
I'm finishing up my PhD in history, and I'm just so amazed at the triumph of technology that here we are thousands of miles away. We're able to talk like this. It's really interesting and a miracle that this sort of technology exists.
I'm glad you say miracle, because it really is. I mean, when I was at Oxford, I was there a lifetime ago. I called home maybe twice a year. You had to put 10p pieces into the phone booth. The phone booth smelled. You know where it is, right across from Hartford College. I'd be out there, 7 hours or 6 hours, different time zone, punching 10p pieces into the phone. And then it was like talking to Mars. There were all these echoes and delays. And now you and I talk a few times a week at least by Zoom technology, and it's as if you're in the room. I mean, you could be upstairs at this moment in my house, or I could be across town at Oxford. So I'm so proud of you for all that you're doing at Oxford University. And of course, there's been a lot of groundswell. Bring Catherine back as a guest host, because they like to watch you, mess with your innocent father. But what an interesting story, and harrowing.
It's quite easy to get caught up in the world that we live in and to think that the language that we use applies to anything and that it can be used in centuries past. And of course, to a certain extent, it can, but even thinking about the way these distinctions worked or how people like Jefferson thought about things like addiction or alcohol or mental illness, just so fascinating and shows what a different world he lived in than the one that we live in.
Different and the same, so different because, today we have all sorts of things to do about depression and mental illness. We have a range of psychotropic drugs. We have counseling. We have therapy. We have serious psychiatry. We have superb mental health institutions. And we understand these things in a way that they simply couldn't in Jefferson's time. For example, we now know there's a biochemical relationship to some of this. They, of course, had no idea how the brain worked at that time. So in a certain sense, we're far ahead of them, and we have no crazy, insane asylums, at least in the first world, as they had back in Jefferson's time. On the other hand, I don't speak for you, but I am the child of an alcoholic. I know what it's like to grow up in an alcoholic household, and I know that the same patterns exist, that you just hope it goes away, that you just want to contain it, that you just want to keep the lid on it, you just want to avoid touching it off, precipitating some bout of it. And my situation was by no means a horrific one. This is very common, and the way we normally cope with these things is to pray and hope they go away. Luckily, that's not the only approach to it we have in the 21st century, but I can feel when you ask me as Jefferson to talk about these, I can feel the sense of impotence and helplessness that a parent, a friend, a lover, a husband, a wife, a child feels in the face of this. And so we're better off in many, many respects, but people like to keep these things really private, and people often fail to get the help that they need.
Access is huge. Many people live in deserts of sorts where they can't access mental health care that they need or might benefit from. And it's truly unfair. We're not all working with the same resources, even though we live in the same country.
Right. If you're a member of the Kennedy family or the Hilton family or X, you have access to all sorts of very high quality, extremely expensive, almost concierge places to go to face your addictions and so on. And we have superb mental health care for the haves. So Jefferson's response to this, and he's a very upbeat man. He's almost the Pollyanna of American history. But he sensed some of this in himself, Catherine, and he said that his response was, aside from his stoicism, which he did master, was just hard work. He said, determined, to his daughter, who was suffering a little bit in Paris, he said, determined never to be idle. He who works constantly will never complain of a want of time. The idleness breeds ennui, and ennui allows hypochondria and so on. That the answer is to keep busy, and of course that is an answer. He also
That's not the only answer, and that's not enough for most people. I mean, that to me is someone who's never truly struggled, because that just doesn't make sense.
His other answer was that we should walk. That walking is an extremely important mental health protocol, as a ritual, and I have found that to be certainly true in my own life. But when you hear the story of poor Anne Cary Randolph Bankhead, you just ache, don't you? I mean, I feel helpless 200 years after the fact, because it's one thing to think that this happens. Of course, it happens all the time, but to think that it happened at Monticello, the picture Jefferson wants to create of Monticello is this Horatian farm, agriculture, agrarian life, harmony, violin concertos, French food, good wine, beautiful conversation. Of course, slavery. But that's not what was happening at all. Towards the end of his life, he was consumed with debt. His family was coming apart. He was more worried, frankly, about Thomas Mann Randolph than he was about Anne, because Thomas Mann Randolph was the patriarch of his family of 11 children, and he was losing control of his own life. And Jefferson is just kind of beside himself and helpless. But it certainly is a corrective to any notion we have of the sage of Monticello quietly going about his idyllic life on the mountain after he retired from the presidency.
It's so emblematic of Jefferson, isn't it? That his own life is so different in every possible way from the sort of normative world that he preaches and desires. And so It's a surprise in some sense, and it's also not a surprise because we know how frequently Jefferson himself failed to live up to his own claims about what was right and wrong. And also the fact that this would continue, and that this would, I don't mean to ascribe blame to Jefferson necessarily in this situation, but what you say about Jefferson being more concerned about his grandson than his granddaughter also says so much about the patriarchal world that he lived in. The fact that this woman was literally being beaten, almost some would say to death, and that his concern is greater for his grandson is shocking.
I'm not certain that that's true. I think it was probably equal concern. I think he actually loved his granddaughters in a way that he never fully loved his grandson, even his favorite grandson, Jeff. But I take your point, but the point I would make is that, we talk about harmony. Well, there are 200 enslaved people in and around this plantation, and it's not all harmony there. That these overseers were often brutes themselves. Violence and the threat of violence were the only way to hold this institution together. There was violence, of course, used against enslaved peoples. There was probably violence within the enslaved community too, because of the severe pressures that this institution created and the deep frustrations. So when we even the previous myth, take what happened to Anne Randolph out of the picture. Even without that, it would be I think a silly thing to talk about an idyllic Monticello. No slave plantation was idyllic.
No, of course not. And at every turn, Jefferson fails to live up to his own prescriptions for what the world ought to be.
So just for our listeners, a book they might read, William Rohrbaugh, Rorabaugh, The Alcoholic Republic, An American Tradition, a book published quite a while ago. The Alcoholic Republic, An American Tradition. What he shows is that they were drinking about 3 times more per capita per day than we do. And that it was really, a world of widespread drunkenness. That this just was America at the time. And we're much more sober today than we were then. It's pretty amazing to think that this was the case. But and when I talk about this or lecture about it or even perform, people often say, well, the water was no good. But that doesn't explain this. And in fact, one of the most interesting chapters in Rohrbaugh's book, The Alcoholic Republic, is called The Pursuit of Happiness. And he argues that for many people in these frontier circumstances, being able to get drunk was a sign of their freedom, that they had complete freedom to behave as they wished.
Fascinating subject. And thank you so much for having me on to talk about it. I appreciate this.
I hope you'll come back and do some more guest hosting. It's such a pleasure. The technology is available, and I think that it's just, I think our listeners really appreciate when you are the host. So we'll see you all next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.